Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, a podcast by a UFO nerd and his tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And my name is Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd and a tolerant friend.
We started this podcast because since 2017, there have been shocking revelations, from news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed videos of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that we know the government has recovered non-human technology.
Or at least, we will once Garry Nolan finishes evaluating all those UAP samples he's got.
It raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly, some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
And they may still be unlikely. But even if it's new science and not aliens,
it's a very exciting time.
It is. Quick reminder before we get into it, you can find our show notes at veryexcitingtime.com, and you can support us by going to patreon.com/veryexcitingtime, where you can also find extra content, like the Q&A that we just recorded with a special guest.
Who's it going to be? Did we get Chris Mellon on the show? Is it Garry Nolan?
I don't know.
You'll never know. All right, Chuck, I've got a fun show for you today. I actually think, aside from just it being fun to record the podcast with you and you kind of looking forward to it, I hope be an awkward time to find out you didn't.
Dead face as I'm reading the notes. Sorry.
Today's topic, I think, is genuinely right up your alley. So I mentioned a few months ago that the Sol Foundation, S-O-L, like our son, which was founded by Garry Nolan and some other dudes, put on a symposium. We've been waiting for the videos to drop. They finally dropped. I spent the other day watching most of the videos and writing up notes. And one of them in particular, man, is right up your alley. This guy is looking at the physics of UFOs. It's like, okay, well, the radar track says they were going this fast. What does that mean? What would it take to go that fast? What are the consequences of going that fast? So for a rocketry nerd, I think you're going to get into it.
Yeah, sounds good.
I will say, man, this was one of the roughest shows to prepare, kind of on par with Virginia. Virginia was hard because there's so much information, and I want to make sure I don't get it wrong. I'm like, and then this happened, and everybody in Virginia is like, what the hell is he talking about? That never happened.
Yeah, right.
Today it was hard because although all of these videos were about UFOs and aliens and stuff that I'm very interested in, and I'm excited to watch, people like Chris Mellon and Garry Nolan talk, it is still hours and hours of videos of dudes standing at a podium talking about PowerPoint slides.
Kryptonite.
It was just,
oh man,
it took me right back to college, man. It doesn't matter how fascinating you find the topic, watching people do PowerPoints is inherently boring. And then I'm trying to take notes and write down relevant quotes. Oh, it was brutal.
God, that sounds, well, thank you for your service in watching all those so I don't have to.
There you go. But before we get into it, you know how the other episode we were talking about Superbowl commercials, right? Hey, all these UFO references at the Super Bowl. Well, as you can tell by looking at me, I'm a bit of a fashionista. Super into 100%. The world of haute couture. And, the happenings in Fashion Week have been high on my radar. And
I'm sure.
Suffice to say, somebody at Fashion Week apparently did a UFO inspired line. I'm not familiar with it. So allow me to bring in our first correspondent. It's a very exciting times fashion correspondent, Annie Vandehei. Annie, how you doing?
I am Annie, and sorry, I have all 4 cats in here, so forgive me if any of this goes a little awry. They've been happening. Anyway, okay. So, as you all have probably guessed, it's not very often that our very special interests intersect. And so when they do, it's very fun for me. I will say, honey, you're very on point with your fashion today. I know you didn't mean to wear a Dune shirt, but it's actually, nobody can tell you wearing a Dune shirt, but that's okay. It's very on point for what I'm about to talk about. So the other night, I'm skimming pics of New York Fashion Week, like I do. And I see a collection that's Dune inspired. And I'm like, oh, this is really nice. It's really, and of course, it's Christian Siriano, who we love.
He's the one who's a big deal, right? That was his whole deal.
I don't know if you know this. I'm a very big deal.
Kind of a big deal.
Kind of a big deal. He's our favorite boy. So gorgeous, Dune inspired, flowy, desert colors, all of that. And I was like, oh, I'll take a note of this because, Scott might be interested. We're often talking about the Zendaya crossovers into like fashion and, music and movies and stuff. And because it's not so like sci-fi on a runway is not an unheard of collection. Like there's been sci-fi on the runway and various things, alien things, whatever. So I was like, okay, it's interesting. And then I come across, I'm skimming and I come across a corset that straight up has like a UFO on it with like the light and like people looking at it. And I'm like, what? So I was definitely, so that I was more interested and I was like, oh, Scott's going to love this. There's we just said, we just been talking about the Superbowl and how normalized the UFO conversation has become and when something becomes you can tell something is getting more normalized as you see it in different industries, and across different cultures where the idea is going to reach different people. Right. So having just come off, he was telling me all about the Super Bowl ads. And then, so I was like, oh, great. Well, now it's hit runway, and so, and this, so it's this very weird, cool collection. I wanted to read you a little bit because then I went and read the review and looked at the whole collection again today. And it's even a little more interesting than just, the one UFO picture I thought. So it's the Mons Fall 2024 ready to wear. It's called The Invasions of Aliens and AI.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know. So they say it's a wonderfully weird and wearable alien and AI tinge UFOs, CEOs, and OOOs Mons collection from Laura Kim and Fernando Garcia. And they're saying things like, I feel like they're coming, we've been thinking a lot about aliens lately, and it's already like a weird kind of brand apparently. But what they did for part of it, which I thought was really interesting and turned out really well, was they did an AI prompt for one of their, what would this, to get a jumpstart for one of the collections. So they asked the AI, what would the Mons world in alien land look like? And the result was a surrealist tinged alien eye floral splashed across a satin shirt dressing, a standout chunky turtleneck, and a sheer frock. And I was like, I'm totally here for this. And they look amazing. Wow. I know. So cool. I'm going to have Scott link to this so you can see all the pictures if you want to. But there's very much, so there's that, but there's also, so they take so the 50s sci-fi movie poster kind of thing that I saw on a corset. So they have that in different, pants and dresses, they take that picture and they do lots of different interesting things with tapestry and belt buckles and florals and shears and the usual boobs and everything. It's pretty great. But yeah, it was just really, really cool to see because they also were one of them said it's a bit of a military vibe to be protected from aliens. And the other one said it's being protected from the invasion of AI. And I don't know. I was just it's a really, really cool collection. But it was just super cool to see this other people thinking about, not in just straight up sci-fi way, but also an alien way, right? So, and I'm always interested in anything that combines a lot of textures and all of that. So, so I went looking to see have there been other runway shows? And, again, just talking about over the years, is this new or has this been going on for a while? And I just wasn't paying attention. So yeah, there's another article I'll link, have Scott link to, but it just 10 times aliens have been on the runway over the years, starting in the 60s, right? With moon landing stuff and whatever, what would moon, and then different kind of So there have been at least 10 of, different big designers doing alien type, different ways of inspired looks on the runway and, all these different ideas. But one of them that I thought, so about in the middle of that article, there's one from Jeremy Scott, who's Moschino. He's also very out there a lot of times. But in 2018, he did like a Jackie O inspired alien situation. And it's like very much inspired by like the CIA stuff and, JFK talking to Marilyn Monroe about aliens or something, like all the different like kind of just the legends of that time. So there's totally like a girl, like all these girls like who are blue and look like Jackie O, like go down, like what if, so the natural conclusion, like what if Jackie O was an alien?
Yeah, this
so
is
there's
wild.
totally like, I know. So there's totally like the whole kind of conspiracy stuff, like the people talk about from the 60s. And some guy, so it's like, well, what if we put that on the runway? Sure.
Yeah.
Like,
why not?
Why not? Like,
now,
so it's
when we
really
talked about
visually
the
very,
Super
very
Bowl,
interesting. Yeah.
When we talked about the Super Bowl stuff, the thing that was really interesting there is it wasn't the first time people had made commercials with aliens and UFOs and stuff, but it was a lot of them all at once. And in none of them was the idea of aliens the joke. The joke was always the aliens are in an unexpected situation or a person interacting with aliens is doing something unexpected. But the aliens were just kind of a given. It's kind of like, whatever. So what was the reaction to this? Was it a similar kind of thing or were people thrown by the idea of this being on runway? Like, did you get any sense of like how this played out in the fashion community?
I did not. I didn't look at like, I didn't go that deep on it, to be honest. But it was definitely, well, there was one, usually there's, I guess it's an article that like quoted a bunch of Twitter stuff or something, but I think it's like generally positive and weird. I mean, it's like if a brand is already known for being kind of weird out there, they're like, yeah, whatever. And they just feel like it's more sci-fi and like, whatever. Like,
no, totally.
It's hard to be real weird in like high fashion. I mean, like there's been so much stuff over the years, right? That like it's hard to be like it's not like the idea of this would be the standout,
Sure.
like oh my god, this is weird. But I think that again, it's just another way of showing like, oh, it's kind of in the zeitgeist. Like if like if someone like Christian Siriano is thinking about it, I mean, he's a dude and stuff, and he's dressed as Zaya and everything. It's like, and then creating things around that, or people are thinking about it in ways of, the different stories over time, or I saw one of them was even like, it was all this gold, like leg stuff from like C-3PO, like, of course, why not?
No,
like
I think it's
taking
really
the elements from the fashion of movies and things and creating it into the thing. But it's also like, but it was just really funny to see like exactly like a UFO picture incorporated in a bunch of different ways. Cause I was like, well, this is both of us. Our things together, they're merging. So
no, totally. And
it's
I
another
think
little
you
way
hit the
that
nail
there's
on the head when you said sci-fi references aren't anything new, right? Like if you're a fashion designer, it's all about inspiration. What is inspiring you? And it's easy to be by like, oh yeah, I've been watching a lot of fashion science fiction stuff, or hey, I just watched Dune and I came away with a lot of inspiration. It's another thing to go straight to UFOs and alien abductions and stuff like that. Like that is a very particular subset.
Yeah.
So I find that best.
Yeah, it was very much like that classic picture, just like all right. Dope.
Right
That's awesome.
Something we can talk about together.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this inaugural fashion segment on
Fashion Corner.
This is a very exciting time. I'm sure this will become a recurring segment as more of the fashion world is overtaken by UFO mania.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
That's how you'll know.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank
babe.
you. Bye.
All right. So Chuck, oh man, Soul Foundation stuff. It was
Let's do
wild.
it.
I've got a ton of
Let's
notes
get
in
weird.
here. Yeah, let's get weird. I kind of want to just fall right into it because there's so much to talk about. I did not watch all of the videos. There's something like 12 videos. They'll be linked in the show notes. I picked the ones that were kind of most interesting to us. But they had a really interesting group of speakers. They were not all nuts and bolts physics types people. They had Diana Walsh-Pasulka, who is well known for writing a very famous book in the industry. She's actually a religious history professor. Her previous book was about purgatory and Catholic saints and stuff. They had another guy who was talking about Catholic history. They had two people come up and talk about how the US and Canadian government feel about UFOs and have interacted with them over the years. I don't know. It was a really interesting day. The event got a lot of positive feedback at the time. I got a couple of quotes here to talk about. First of all, co-founder Peter Scoffish said, "We want the Soul Foundation to be a kind of nerve center in which serious professionals across academia, across government, within investment and technology communities, within civil society institutions such as religious bodies, are able to come together to be able to network, listen to cutting-edge research on this, and be able to incubate their own projects while they're in a space with a lot of other like-minded individuals." I think that's really interesting because they kind of briefly talked about why are we creating a UFO think tank? And they had a lot of big picture ideas about we're here to help the government figure out how to interact with this. I think this is a little bit more handy, and it ties into Garry Nolan's whole thing about getting into academia and making it safe for scientists to approach this topic, destigmatizing it. So hearing, sorry, go ahead.
I haven't heard this name Peter Scafich before. We haven't discussed him, but should I know that name?
If I had thought about it, I would have looked up his background. He is oh, Jesus Christ. Sorry, I don't want to pull it up. I forget what his background is, but we have not talked about him before. The first time I'd ever heard of him was when he started Soul Foundation with Garry Nolan.
Okay.
Yeah.
That quote was so disconnected businessy guy. I was like, is he some weird billionaire or something? It doesn't
There's
seem
a big overlap between academic language and political language. There's a lot of unnecessarily verbose. One of the other co-founders of Soul Foundation is our good boy, UAP whistleblower David Grush. He actually gave a surprise closing address at the conference. This was kept secret from all the attendees. He was traveling, so he couldn't be there in person, so he did it over Zoom. So the video of it is super funny because he's looming over the camera as the laptop is sitting in his lap.
That's awesome.
But David Grush said, "This is why we have the Soul Foundation. We need to basically create a parallel track of research and independent discovery that are not necessarily dependent on the US government to provide us all the answers." And I think you will see that through line in all of the speakers. And if you go look at the speakers at the inaugural symposium, they're all members of the board of the Soul Foundation.
Okay.
They asked all these people to come in and kind of help inform how it's going to be. And a lot of them, their presentations, I don't know if they were repurposed or if they were later repurposed or if they were kind of written this way. Garry Nolan's presentation that we're going to talk about is pretty obviously a pitch deck to get people interested in this academic thing he's setting up. Chris Mellon gave his presentation. He repurposed that into an article for the debrief. Karl Nell, who we talked about and will talk about, kind of presented a plan for disclosure. It's pretty obvious that he was involved in the group that was kind of helping to pitch how the government should handle this stuff. So Soul Foundation is kind of already doing this stuff, but it was a lot of individuals all doing it. And their goal is to kind of bring it all together and kind of formalize it with a name that can get some respect, as opposed to just, I've heard of Garry Nolan,
Yeah. I mean, so I'm excited that David Grush is involved. That gives me a little more confidence. I didn't didn't know this Peter Scafish, but yeah, our good boy. Like I'll follow whatever he says.
Yeah, if you go look at the About page, pretty much all the names on there are big names that I have a lot of respect for. You will actually see that David Grush and his lawyer, Charles McCullough III, who was the first Intelligence Community Inspector General, are no longer listed on there. That was a minor hubbub in the UFO community. It's like, oh, is David Grush on the outs? And Garry Nolan had to come in and go, no, guys, it's just a weird legal thing. Charles McCullough follows the letter of the law when it says there's a conflict. He was a member of another board that didn't let him participate. He's working on getting it resolved. It's all temporary. They'll be back.
Nice. Cool.
So yeah, up first, I want to talk about Garry Nolan. Garry Nolan, we've spoken about before on the show. He is a professor in the Department of Pathology at Stanford. He mostly does cancer research. But he's gotten quite a bit of attention over the years for getting involved in the UAP world and for bringing a very grounded, science-driven approach to it. In particular, he first came to my attention when he debunked Stephen Greer's claims about the Atacama humanoid. Stephen Greer put together a whole documentary about how this thing was an alien fetus. And Garry Nolan came in and evaluated it. It was like, yeah, sorry to tell you this. This is just a human that had some unfortunate deformities. There's nothing alien about this. Weirdly, the fact that he started out debunking it, but willing to look at it, got him a lot of fans. And for me personally, it helps me lend a lot more credence to it when he says there's something here. Because we've already seen he's willing to tell you when there's nothing there. So his talk. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I feel like, sorry, I don't even know how to process this. Like, how do you have a side hustle of like, yeah, I do cancer research most of the time, but I also dabble in like molecular whatevers. Like, this is kind of incredible.
No, 100%. I don't understand how he does any of this stuff. He casually mentions at one point that all of the like material analysis he's done has all been done in his spare time and out of pocket. And, you know, like at one point he's like, yeah, we got these materials analyzed. That cost us $40,000.
Yeah.
So, you know, like, we're not doing this as part of like a funded program. This is just like, you know, Jacques Vallée came to me with some stuff and I've got access to a lab, but it costs money to run the lab.
Right. That's so wild.
Yeah. So I mentioned already his talk seemed to be aimed more at other scientists and maybe even was like a pitch deck. But in particular, he discussed the work that he's done to analyze particular UAP samples that Jacques Vallée has provided him and how this could turn into kind of a repeatable framework other labs and other scientists could follow in the future.
That's so awesome. Like, I appreciate it. He's always bringing science and rigor into his studies. And it's like, I don't know what these UFO samples are, but if you've got samples, I can analyze them. And I love that idea.
Samples,
makes me want to send him something.
Yeah. I might not be able to say whether those are alien vehicles in the sky, but I can tell you what this metal is made up of.
I can definitely tell you that this is a plastic duck.
Right? Yeah. So I got a quote from Garry Nolan when he started talking. He said, okay, inevitably, we are going to come across something out there that is alien. But how do we engage it and how do we begin? I think we start with the problem. Everything is made of stardust, as Carl Sagan famously said. But the problem is we don't understand the rules of how it all goes together. Well, as a biologist, I study the basic gears and principles of what goes on inside of a cell, and then we basically figure out how it works. So I think of potential UAP materials as something I can approach with the same methodologies that I have with cancer research. It's straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, super straightforward, like curing cancer, right?
Right? Yeah, totally. I think Garry might have a different perspective on what's straightforward than we do, but yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so he continues. He goes, okay, so how would you analyze materials from a UAP? Well, you take it apart piece by piece. You try to understand the components and you ask the question, why is this component here next to that component? What might they be doing with each other? And it's about the data, not the conclusion. Verifiable data and methods are what are peer reviewed.
Yeah. Okay. So straightforward in the sense that like there are basics you can start with and you can build inferences from there.
Yeah.
But maybe not straightforward in the aggregate of like, this is how we make a spaceship out of these.
Yeah. And it's worth mentioning that when he says components, he's talking about like molecular components,
Right,
like he's not getting like a steering wheel and a speedometer and how do these relate? He's getting like a chunk of metal that someone says fell off a UFO, like, I don't know, what is this human metal? Is somebody punking me? How do we investigate that and determine?
Yeah. Right.
So he breaks down a few samples that Jacques Vallée has provided him and what he learned about them. Now, I'm mostly going to focus on the science of what he learned, but I want to be clear. For each of these samples, he opened with a big slide outlining the basic story of where and how it was recovered, what's the provenance of it, what's the chain of custody, and basically like, why do we think this sample is worth looking at? It's not, hey, some rando came up and gave this to me. Here is where we found it and why it's reasonable to think this might be connected with a UAP event and is worth looking at in the first place.
Okay.
So up first, he talked about a metal sample from a UFO incident in Council Bluffs, Iowa in 1977. He briefly discusses the witnesses, the chain of custody, and what they learned from the sample. Now, I didn't understand the science, but the conclusions were really interesting. So they were able to conclude a few things. One, the metal was clearly the result of an industrial process. So this wasn't just like a chunk of natural metal that someone found that fell out of a mountain somewhere or something. This was something that was engineered. The samples...
I want to know more about that.
I know, right? The samples they took showed a slightly different ratio of elements in each, meaning it was incompletely mixed. In this particular case, what they found was there was a UFO, there were a bunch of witnesses to it, and when the police arrived on scene, they found a puddle of molten metal in the middle of this like field. So there's no reason for molten metal to be there. It's reasonable to conclude it was related to the UFO. So the way they take samples is they like scrape off a little bit of material from various spots. And what he's saying is each of those samples had a slightly different mix of elements. They were all the same elements, but in different ratios. So this was not one homogeneous lump of molten metal. This was maybe several bits of metal that melted together and improperly mixed.
Right. Yeah. So like some tool they left on the ground that when they took off melted or something.
He said also, to be clear, there was no sign of technology. It was just molten metal. It's not like, this bit here is a circuit or a chip or there's no nano machines. It was just molten metal. And something that I thought was very interesting, we've talked about this a little bit before, there were no exotic isotope ratios, which is useful because it means this was not conclusively from somewhere else. Avi Loeb, his whole claim, the reason he's confident that his little spherules that he dug up from the bottom of the ocean are from an interstellar meteor is based on the isotopes that they're made up. He's saying these would not naturally be found in the solar system, so they must have come from somewhere else. And we talked about before, that's not necessarily like a slam dunk, but at the very least, exotic isotope ratios are an intriguing indicator it might be from somewhere.
Right.
And the absence of them is an interesting indicator in the opposite direction. It kind of implies that either these are really common isotopes, maybe it is from an alien star system, but these same isotopes, or maybe it was made here. But there is nothing here that says for sure this came from somewhere else.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like he didn't conclude that it was alien or anything like that, just that it looked, I was about to say man-made, but clearly not.
Engineered. Yeah.
Engineered.
Yeah, somebody produced this. An industrial process was used to make it. It didn't happen accidentally.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
And again, to anybody out there who is more science-minded, I am very badly glossing over everything he says. He breaks down the types of machines they use to analyze it. He shows atomic makeups. He shows data and graphs. If you're interested, please, by all means, go watch the video. It'll be linked in the show notes.
Yeah. I may actually watch this one. This sounds really interesting.
He talked about another sample from a UFO explosion in Ubatuba, Brazil in 1957. Again, he goes over witnesses, chain of custody, what they learned from the samples. In this case, he found that they got 2 samples from the site that were supposed to be the kind of lore around them is they were impossibly pure samples of magnesium. When he looked at the 2 samples, one of them fits what he called the natural ratio of isotopes. So if you grabbed a sample of magnesium from Earth, you would expect the ratio makeup to be like this. And it was basically that. The other one was way, way off. It was still magnesium, but a totally different mix of isotopes. Now, Garry makes a really interesting point here. And this is something I think a lot of skeptics land on. They hear, oh, it's a mix of isotopes. Well, someone could have made that. He goes, yeah, absolutely. Someone could have made it. We could do this in the 50s when this sample is from, but it was absurdly expensive. He goes out of his way to point out it is still expensive today. He says, in my cancer research lab, we order bits of metal of particular isotope ranges for experimental standards. And those are crazy expensive. You have to hire a lab to produce them. It's not something you do on a whim. So once again, he concludes that the materials show no sign of technology, but they are clearly the result of an industrial process.
That's so cool. I didn't even know that it was possible, but expensive to do that in the 50s. So it's kind of cool to learn that. But it makes sense that it would be.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, did you get a feeling for how big the samples were?
Yeah, he shows a photo of them. They're just like little dribbles of metal in a little tube, very small.
Okay.
But, I think the point that Garry's trying to make is he's not telling you this isn't man-made. But he's making the point repeatedly that although you want to run science on the samples, you also have to consider the context in which these samples were recovered. These pieces were picked up off a beach in Brazil in the 50s after an explosion of an unknown aerial object. Now, if you want to try to make the case that the US government was making some sort of weird spy drone out of an unusual magnesium isotope, is it possible? Sure. But why? Like, what reason would you have to make this particular type of magnesium? Why would you be flying it over Brazil? Why would it blow up? Like, it's a lot of work if you're trying to say it's a hoax. And I think we find ourselves in this UFO world, in the UFO world a lot, where it's like, okay, we're not saying conclusively it's alien, but if all of the possible answers that say it's not alien are stretching the bounds of credulity more than the idea that it's aliens, maybe it's time to give that idea a shake, And then the final sample he talked about was from another famous encounter, the Lonnie Zamora incident in Socorro, New Mexico from 1964. He was able to show that it was a very unusual sample of aluminum and zinc side by side. Now, what I mean by this is it's a single piece of metal, and you can very clearly see it's made up of 2 types of metal. It's like there's like a seam running through it, as if 2 bits of metal have been joined together. So one side was aluminum, one side is zinc. But there was very little mixing. And he's saying, again, this is very clearly the result of an industrial process.
Why? I'm curious, like, what about it not being mixed makes it an industrial process?
I don't know for sure. He doesn't explain it super well, but the impression I got was he was saying when he's looking at this, I forget the name of it was like tomography or something, but basically he described it as being like a sandblaster that blasts little atoms off of it. But then in the detector, you're able to put back together a 3D map of where those samples came from. And he's able to show all these samples. And there is an incredibly precise dividing line between them, like an atom thick. And if you were to say weld two pieces of metal together, you would not see that precise a dividing line. So again, it's not necessarily impossible, but why would someone make this? What reason do you have for this precision? What process could result in this precision? And who would be doing it in 1964?
Right. Yeah. And like, we can do something sort of like that with, like we see this in CPU fabs, but that's now.
Yeah, exactly.
Like not 1964. That's really interesting.
So Garry wraps up by saying that he's setting up a new initiative, the Stardust Repository, which is going to offer standardized testing with a federation of other scientists with access to labs and tools that would otherwise be incredibly expensive. This is where he mentioned that when he ran these other tests, it was $40,000. He mentions specifically, Avi Loeb is not only in the audience, he was one of the speakers that day. He says, this is what Avi Loeb had to do with the samples that he got back from the South Pacific. And this is what Garry has been doing with these samples. So what he wants to do is to standardize this and put out a set of protocols for others so that other people who have samples don't have to reinvent the wheel.
That's incredible.
Right?
When you think about it, like we've come so far from giggling little UFO men or little alien men to the point where like scientists can set up open testing facilities and programs like this and Galileo, and sometimes even get funding for them. Like that's crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've come a long way. All right. So again, I want to keep this going because we've got 3 other speakers to get through. Our next speaker is Chris UFO Daddy Mellon, talking about the potential consequences of disclosure. Now,
catastrophic or otherwise.
Chris Mellon is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, and of course, one of the oldest supporters of our podcast. I've got a lot of quotes from Chris's talk, as opposed to everywhere else where I'm doing a lot of paraphrasing, because Chris turned his talk almost verbatim into an article on the debrief a couple days later. We actually talked briefly about it when it came out. But it's so good. So I'm going to open with one of my favorite parts of the article of the talk here. He says, imagine you were just elected president of the United States. During one of your first classified briefings, you learned that the U.S. military has recovered advanced extraterrestrial technology. You're told we've made only modest headway in understanding how this technology works, where it is from, or why these intelligently controlled machines are here. What would you do in that circumstance? As president,
is that a real question? Should I answer? No, God.
He goes on. He says, as president, your top priority is to keep the American people safe from all threats, both foreign and domestic. Are you going to hold a press conference revealing that aliens are visiting planet Earth, but that we don't know where they're from, why they're here, or whether we can defend ourselves? It's hard for me to imagine any of the politicians I've worked for over the years leaping at that opportunity. What chance would you have as president of moving forward on other vital issues on your agenda, given the tumult that would result? What reason is there to believe that the net effect for society would be positive rather than negative? That's really the meat of his question here. He says, strangely, there is little discussion of this critical issue among proponents of disclosure in the UAP community. Perhaps advocates of disclosure simply assume that truth and transparency are always for the better. And although I applaud that sentiment, the issue is not so simple for government officials bearing the weighty responsibility of governing. I therefore thought I would offer some thoughts from the standpoint of a former national security official because national security concerns are inescapably central to this discussion.
Yeah, that's really cool. I feel like we should try and answer this ourselves in the next Q&A session.
Sure.
But it is, I mean, it is a good reminder that while aliens would be the biggest story in human history, politicians do have goals that might not be served by making history.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like may not be on your agenda, you know?
Yeah. Although it'd be pretty cool to be the alien president.
Like, yeah, absolutely. I don't know, man. I go back and forth on this. What I really like about what Chris is doing here is pointing out that it's not a simple answer, right? It's not as obvious as, yes, of course you disclose, or no, of course you do not. There's a lot of stuff wrapped up in this. And this is a thread we're going to be covering through the other speakers, especially Karl Nell later when he talks about the downsides of disclosure.
Right.
And Chris is kind of hinting at the same thing here. He says, when I first became publicly involved in the UAP topic, my immediate goal was to alert policymakers to a dangerous intelligence failure, namely the fact of serious and recurring intrusions into restricted DOD airspace by strange unidentified aircraft. It was shocking to learn that our vaunted multi-billion-dollar intelligence system was paralyzed by stigma, placing U.S. personnel and the nation at risk. This situation reminded me of both Pearl Harbor, where vital warning information was not forwarded up the chain of command, as well as 9/11, when intelligence agencies failed to share vital information that could have saved the lives of thousands of innocent civilians. Having survived the attack on the Pentagon myself, this was not a purely theoretical consideration.
Wow. Huh. Yeah. I know he catches flack for focusing on security, but I do appreciate that emphasis on security, on intelligence failures. It sounds like he was concerned because we aren't taking it seriously, not because of something else.
And this is literally his job, right? Is to look at how are we handling this. And, you know, he's looking around like, oh, we're doing pretty good over here. We're paying attention to that. Whoa. What do you mean?
Hey,
no one's looking at this.
Yeah.
He says, I want to challenge the recurring assertion that the UAP issue is primarily for scientists, not politicians or government officials. Current intelligence collected by the U.S. I want to interject. I love this part because it's easy to kind of lose track of what we're dealing with. And Chris has this one brief paragraph here that just like hammers home the point, like, these are real nuts and bolts things. There may be more to the phenomenon than nuts and bolts, but just looking at the nuts and bolts is enough to be like, we should be doing something. He says, current intelligence collected by the U.S. indicates that our military is encountering intelligently controlled, solid objects invading restricted military airspace, sometimes flying information on an almost daily basis.
Whoa.
Many of these objects are emitting radiation in the 1 to 3 and 8 to 12 gigahertz range. Multiple credible reports indicate that UAP has rendered segments of our nuclear deterrent inoperable. In other cases, they're jamming radars on fighter aircraft. We also have multiple cases of near midair collisions and cases involving serious injuries to military and civilian personnel. And therefore, as much as we need and want scientific investigations, the government cannot be permitted to divest itself of the UAP issue.
Interesting. So, so he says many of the objects are emitting radiation. And I just want to be clear, like, that just means radio. I
don't know what the 1 to 3 and 8 to 12 gigahertz range is, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're radioactive.
No, exactly. Our phones emit in those same ranges. Well, not quite 8 to 12, but 2.4 gigahertz is Wi-Fi A
Got it.
through C. And Wi-Fi 5 is like 5 gig. Well, there's a bunch of 5 gigahertz. There's also 6 gigahertz. But we've been talking about doing 10 gigahertz for a while.
No, totally.
So it's really interesting that they would emit on similar ranges. Ours were chosen partly for technological reasons, but partly because those sections just weren't claimed, or rather were claimed, but released. So it's interesting that they would choose similar ranges.
I mean, maybe they're emitting on those frequencies because we're active on them.
For a reason, yeah. Maybe they're trying to talk to us.
Right. I found that particular line interesting because all the other stuff we've heard about, like you can almost source each of the claims he makes. Like, oh, he's talking about the Nimitz. Oh, that's from this. That's the Malmhurst guy, right?
Yeah.
But we've heard a couple of people, including Lue Elizondo, hinting that we know how to detect these things now, that there is a frequency we can look for and find them. And now here's Chris just flatly saying,
there it is.
Some of them emit signals. Wow. Okay. That's awesome.
If you were trying to talk to a whale and all you normally worked with was your ears, you might come to the conclusion that whale noise is communication. But what if your primary communication style was radio frequency radiation? What if they're trying to talk to us because all they see is us talking over Wi-Fi all the time?
Yeah, exactly.
And I love this idea.
Sending out like modem screeches and stuff.
Yeah, it's just, oh my God, the song of our people.
Yeah. So Mellon goes on because, again, the point of this article is from a defense standpoint, does disclosure even make sense? As a political official, should you even think about this?
Yeah.
He says the first question that arises is, how can we make a fair determination about the potential risks and benefits of disclosure without access to all the facts? Sure. Suppose the US government recovered extraterrestrial technology decades ago. This is not a supposition. He knows for a fact this is true because he talks to guys like David Grush. But I love that he's like, let's just say, for the sake of argument, in that case, there has inevitably been some progress in assessing and hopefully some insights gleaned regarding its nature and intent of its designers. One of the only things we can say with certainty is that unless ETs prove to be angelic, which is not what our military is reporting, disclosure would undeniably frighten, if not terrify, large segments of the population.
Sure.
I always get nervous when I hear someone say this, but I think all he's trying to do here is acknowledge that you can't just go on the news and be like, hey guys, aliens exist and they're here. Like you gotta prep the ground a little more than that, or people are gonna
maybe. I still I think about that meme we had we talked about a little while ago where someone was like, oh yeah, now aliens are here. I don't have time for this shit.
I guess. Yeah, exactly. He says, moreover, and this was actually last time we talked about this article, this was the one quote I lifted from it. He said, moreover, what if disclosure itself precipitated a change in the behavior of an alien civilization, given that they no longer had an incentive to remain elusive and clandestine? What is the risk potential that disclosure might cause some governments to overreact, precipitating fearful and aggressive interactions? If these risks are substantial, does it still make sense to release such disruptive information?
Yeah. I mean, this is where you can really see his intelligence background. Like, do we want to burn that spy or not?
Right. Well, and also getting back to the idea of, okay, it's not just how will the population react. Disclosure is a thing that other people and intelligence will react to. Our people are one element who will react to it. The NHI is another group that could react to it, and other governments react to it. Maybe the American people handle it. Maybe the aliens are fine with it, and then Russia loses their mind and launches a nuke. That's something you have to consider. It may or may not be likely, but if you're in a national security framework, that's the kind of thinking you have to do around this.
Right. or other NHI that aren't the NHI that are here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So he kind of wraps this up by going, okay, well, what are the kind of historical precedents? He says, okay, nothing as potentially ontologically shocking as UAP disclosure has ever occurred, certainly not in modern times, but there are still some interesting historical precedents we can examine. Consider the Sputnik issue that arose in 1957. Sputnik was merely a small satellite emitting tracking signals, not a weapons system. And yet, the mere fact that America was lagging behind the Soviet Union in space and missile technology immediately became a major political issue. Yeah. Other examples are tragic when we look at first contact between more technologically advanced civilizations and indigenous people. The consequences often proved catastrophic for the less technologically advanced.
Yeah.
Standard. In the case of Sputnik, we have an awareness of a potential threat. In the second instance, we have an actual invasion and occupation. So a key question to ask is whether disclosure might provoke hostilities. That seems highly unlikely. And so, although the Sputnik case is far less shocking and provocative than disclosure would be, it may be a more appropriate model than tragic cases involving European contact with pre-industrial indigenous societies.
I wonder why he thinks hostilities are unlikely.
That's a really good question, and I wish he had talked about it a little more. My best guess is I think he means because there has been no sign of hostility from UFOs thus far. Like you can't say for sure, but if they haven't done anything aggressive yet, why assume that they're going to if we tell the world about them?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but they're alien. Like the fact that they're not acting like aggressive humans isn't really relevant. Dolphins and octopi also don't act like aggressive humans when they're being aggressive. But
absolutely. Yeah. The dangers of anthropomorphism are very real when you're talking about alien civilizations.
That's a good word. Not a word I can usually say. Thank you for saying.
So he kind of wraps it up with, I believe that a graduated process of disclosure would avert a crisis atmosphere while prompting new investments in technology, scientific research, and a rash of collaborative international meetings and initiatives. Processing this unsettling information would certainly take time, but danger and fear of the unknown have always been inherent in the human condition, and people would, as always, adapt. He makes the comparison that, like, most people in the US live in cities that are targeted by Russian nukes, and we just go about our day. Like, it's just the reality, like, whatever. If some UAP proved to be extraterrestrial, people would still get out of bed the next day, go through their morning wake-up rituals, and head to school or work. Disclosure would undoubtedly alter the trajectory of our species, but almost certainly for the better.
Yeah. I'm not surprised that UFO Daddy came out as pro-disclosure, and I really like the gradual process, because that's kind of what it feels like is happening right now, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it's cool to hear his explanation from that sort of like national security standpoint. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I found it particularly fascinating because a lot of the whistleblowers that we see, they talk about it from more of almost kind of a moral standpoint. It's immoral to keep this information secret. And, I agree with that, obviously. But Chris has been operating at a fairly high level of power in the US government for a long time, and he has a unique insight into this. So hearing him explain, hey, I grappled with this. Here I am advocating for disclosure. What if I'm wrong? What if this is a bad idea? And what is the thought process he went through, and what were the concerns he had, and how did he still come out the other side feeling that it was still good for humanity? So,
totally.
Thank you, Chris. This was a great presentation. In this case, you don't have to watch the video because almost word for word, he put the whole thing into a disclosure, into an article in the debrief. That's in the show notes. But the video is also great.
So Scott, I know you remember this. We used to work with a security researcher at work. And one of the funny things was getting his take on how he would solve problems, because they were always like, just like 90 degrees off from what I would do.
I feel like his whole view of the world was of attack vectors.
Yeah. I feel like intelligence kind of has that same thing where you think about it from a totally different angle, and I love it. I love seeing that, and I'm also glad I don't have to think like that.
Oh, 100%. 100%. Yeah. All right, buddy, this is the one that I think you're going to be really excited about. Yeah? So up next, we got Kevin Knuth. And forgive me if I'm butchering that name. I wonder if it's supposed to be Knuth, but I heard someone say Knuth, so I'm going to say the K.
That's how.
And he gave a talk. He gave a talk on the physics of UAP. He is an associate professor of physics at the University of Albany. He is a former NASA scientist, and he is a current member of UAPX, which is a UFO investigation group. UAPX has been kind of all over the news. I actually told you a story about them at one point when we were talking about Skinwalker Ranch. I don't know if you remember this, but they set up a big observation and experiment one night where Travis Taylor was going to do his favorite thing. He was going to launch rockets into the air and see if he could provoke something. And UAPX showed up, and they were going to set up a bunch of monitoring equipment. And they've got, those people who drive trucks into hurricanes? And they've got like special vehicles that are loaded with sensors, and they're designed. UAPX has a vehicle like that. It's like a mobile command center that connects with all their equipment. And every single time they got ready to launch a rocket, they would go, 5, 4, and it would cut to the dude in the truck and go, fuck. And like all of his computers would go down. And then he'd, quickly reboot everything and get it all together, and the rocket's already launched.
Yeah.
It happened something like 7 or 8 times in a row. Like, it was clearly not equipment failure, because it was very precisely timed to 2 seconds before the rocket launched. You don't have time to fix it. It was like someone was fucking with it.
That's so funny.
So they're heavy into investigation. They have arguably recorded some footage. I don't know how seriously to take their group, but they're interesting to pay attention to. Kevin Knuth is apparently part of that group.
They're living their dream, though.
They really are, yeah. So he starts out by talking about the 5 observables that Lue Elizondo has talked about. And, what is the difference between, and I forget the term he used, but like an actual UFO versus just something that's in the air that we haven't identified yet. And there is a difference. And a big part of it is the 5 observables, right? A trash bag floating through the air is not going to move at hypersonic velocities or exhibit cloaking or, do any of these other transmedium things, stuff like that.
Right.
So he wants to start out by talking about a couple of the observables, which are about speed, both sudden and instantaneous acceleration, and also hypersonic velocity without any signatures, such as the sonic boom.
Right.
So he starts out by talking about the Tic Tac UFOs in the Nimitz encounter. These were observed on radar repeatedly to drop from 28,000 feet to sea level in 0.78 seconds. Now,
is that a lot?
That's exactly it, right? As a civilian, I don't really, I guess it's fast, 1 second from 28,000 feet, but I don't know.
I just don't even know what 28,000 feet looks like.
He says, that is crazy and really anomalous. How anomalous? Well, we can do the calculations. You can estimate the minimum acceleration, okay? If they accelerated halfway and then decelerated the other way, that gives you a lower bound for the acceleration, which comes out to be 5,400 Gs. 5,000 times the acceleration of gravity. People are not going to survive this. Most equipment won't survive this. An F-35's wings will rip off at about 13 Gs. So 5,000 Gs is really anomalous.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm looking up what like G forces are for rocketry, and they're usually not exceeding more than like 3 or 4, sometimes maybe 6.
Right.
And
yeah, and I know when they were testing astronauts, I think they tested some of the astronauts up maybe as high as 10 Gs, but like those were human experiment trials. That is well outside the bounds of like we would operate equipment like this. It was more like, what happens if you split an astronaut that fast?
So
anyway,
like,
I felt the same way. I'm like 28,000 to sea level in a second. I don't know what that means. Hearing that at 13 Gs, an F-35 will rip apart really helps put it in perspective for me.
Right.
That was a really useful fact.
Yeah, and like in some ways, an airplane is going to be engineered to not greatly exceed what's necessary. But still, it's an interesting point of view.
Well, it's one of those things like if an F-35 rips apart at 13 Gs and they clock the UFO going at, say 50 Gs.
Right.
We're within an order of magnitude of it, right?
Yeah.
Like your calculation might be off. They might just have some really good materials or great padding. Yeah. Maybe it's fluid filled. You could come up with a rationale. Sure. But we're several orders of magnitudes off, 13 to 5,000. Even if he's wrong about the 5,000, let's say it's only 1,000, it's still the same like distance there of like nothing we can build is going to come out the other side of that operational unless it's just like a solid brick of metal.
Exactly.
He talks about how much power it would take to accelerate like this. He says, of course, to do this, you need to know the mass. Well, we don't know the mass, but these things were estimated to be about the size of an F-18, and an F-18 is around 10,000 kilograms of mass. We decided to take a much lower bound. Let's say maybe 1/10 of the mass of an F-18. Okay. If you do that, you come out to a power of 1,100 gigawatts. This is more than 10 times the total nuclear output of the United States.
Yeah. It's like Doc Brown's 1.21 gigawatts. It just seems so tiny.
Right. He made that exact joke. Yeah. But again, like it's a useful scale. Like we're used to thinking of, a single gigawatt is a lot. And here's, a thing the size of a VW bus that would have to have a power output of more than the entire US nuclear power plant capacity.
Yeah.
Like you're operating on a whole other level here. Again, even if his numbers are off, the scale is so far beyond that it doesn't make any sense. It's still worth looking at. He also discusses several other cases with good, reliable radar data, which also show high speeds. The radar observations from the Minot Air Force Base encounter in 1968 showed speeds of Mach 12, which is 9,200 miles per hour, and would pull 209 Gs. And the radar from the famous JAL encounter over Alaska in 1986 showed that the UFO would jump at speeds of Mach 350, which is 269,000 miles per hour, and would pull 9,000 Gs. He says, quote, 296,000 miles per hour through the air with no sonic boom. Don't ask me how. That's the anomaly.
Right. Yeah. Those speeds are wild. Like, I know NASA's working on some stuff to reduce sonic booms right now, but like they've been working on that for a really long time. And
exactly.
I don't know.
Yeah, and he goes on about that idea of no signatures, because the other thing is it's not just sonic booms. At that speed, you would expect fireballs and generating plasma. Like the air itself is a problem. He says they don't make sonic booms or fireballs, which you would expect. So something very strange is going on.
Yeah.
One thing that's almost never mentioned is there's no energy deposition when they stop. Again, these pilots have described them coming to a complete standstill very quickly. This thing drops from 28,000 feet to sea level, getting up to about 42,000 miles per hour in the middle, and then just stops. Where did all that energy go? Energy doesn't just disappear. When this thing comes to a stop, there ought to have been an explosion. And given the amount of power that it took, you can estimate how big the explosion would have been. It should have been an explosion with about the same amount of energy as 100 tons of TNT or 250 Tomahawk cruise missiles simultaneously blowing. Wow. That's what should have happened. It didn't. What's going on? We don't know. I treat all of these as clues to figure out how these things work.
Oh my God. Imagine that engineering meeting. Good news, we figured out how to go 42,000 miles per hour and can fly from New York to LA in 30 minutes. The bad news is you'll leave a crater where Hollywood used to be.
Right? You can do it once.
Once. Exactly.
Yeah. He goes on. He says, why do people always assume that they're spacecraft? It's simple. Because they fly as fast as spacecraft do. At 296,000 miles per hour, you can get to the moon in less than 60 minutes. This is really remarkable. And he puts up a slide that the aerospace-minded among you will love. Chuck, I'm sure you're going to be looking it up later.
Yeah.
He says, here is a plot of ship speed under constant acceleration. If you accelerate at 1,000 Gs, you can get to 90% of the speed of light in 17 hours. You can get to 90% of the speed of light in less than a day if you maintain that acceleration in space. That's at 1,000 Gs. The Tic Tac case, we estimated at 5,000 Gs. The JAL airline case was 10,000 Gs. At 10,000 Gs, you can get up to 90% of the speed of light much, much faster. How far can you go? Well, once you're traveling close to the speed of light, relativity kicks in. So for the traveler, you can traverse great distances in short periods of time. At 2,000 Gs, you can get to the nearest star, Proxima Centauri, in about 3 days. At 10,000 Gs, you can reach any star within 50 light years in less than a day. It's a day trip for you. Now, for the rest of us, it's 50 years, but it's possible.
Wow. Yeah. That's so interesting. I had always rejected the idea of relativistic travel because of time dilation and a lot of other things. Who would take that one-way trip and never come home? But it is interesting still thinking about what the EBO scientists said, that they're bred for a purpose. Maybe that's this, but I mean that these speeds make it seem like screw it. You can take that travel. It's only a day trip.
Absolutely. As long as you're not concerned about coming back to the people you left behind.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, this changes the whole equation.
Yeah, you just got to take them with you.
Yeah. Now, he goes on to talk about a lot of other stuff. I figured the speed stuff would be most interesting to Chuck as a person with an interest in rocketry, but some of the other things really stood out to me. He talked about luminosity, right? So it's really common to report that UFOs glow brightly. He pulled up some photos Jacques Vallée had provided him where they had estimated how bright. If you have the original negatives, you can do some math, which I'll admit I did not understand at all, that helps you understand, given the exposure of this photograph, how bright that object would have to be. He said luminosities coming off of these photographed UFOs were on the order of 2,000 to 30,000 megawatts of light coming off the craft. He said, who the heck needs 1,000 megawatt lights? What would you use them for? Why would you do this? It doesn't make any sense. I have no idea what the purpose of such a light would be. Perhaps the propulsion system somehow gives off light like this as a byproduct, which, would give you a clue as to how their propulsion systems work. That's interesting. But then you have to worry about what kind of people have propulsion systems that waste thousands of megawatts and they don't care about it. That tells you something about the amounts of energy they're willing and able to play with.
Yeah. You know, there's an economics principle about exactly that, that energy is very closely, energy waste is very closely correlated to like the GDP and fortune, I guess, of countries. And it makes sense. Like,
yeah.
Just
I mean, it's old school, right? Like the reason kings used to be fat, they could afford to eat. It was a sign of wealth, you know? Like,
yeah. But even with us, it's like, you know, how much energy does it actually take to get running water into our house? It feels like such a small thing, but as a society collectively, like that's a massive amount of energy going into it. And so it could be viewed as wasteful, but for aliens, maybe it's not wasteful. Maybe there's a purpose, and when you're going that fast, maybe you need.
We talked. One of the whistleblowers mentioned that the power output of the craft was measured at so many gigawatts, and we talked at the time about how that matches, you know, the entire daily output of the U.S. power grid was coming off of this one car engine, basically. So, I think what we're getting pretty reliably across these reports is this idea of power is apparently cheap for if you've got this technology. And if power is cheap, it lets you do things that maybe we wouldn't consider now, because it's like, well, you can't do that. That is so absurdly expensive. Well, not if power is abundant.
What if it weren't?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that's really interesting on the luminance topic, he points out you can compute how bright this object is, but an object this bright should be illuminating everything around it, like the sun. You know, like it's an incredibly bright, and we don't see that. We see an incredibly bright white object in the middle of a photo, and the clouds around it are just illuminated like normal.
Right.
So that suggests that either we somehow don't understand the effect, or even more alarming, maybe the light is somehow targeted at the viewer, and he does some math and he figures out it would take a lot less energy if the light is coming straight at the camera. But then you have to ask, why? What is happening here?
That is one potential explanation. It could also be fake. That's another one.
Absolutely.
But it is interesting, and I think we do similar things with rangefinders and stuff like that, where we'll if we wanted to take a photo of something with our camera, our rangefinder would shoot out like an infrared beam, and if we saw infrared, that might be really offensive.
I think what I like about this guy's talk is not necessarily, oh, I think his math is right. You know, like it might be wrong. He's doing back of the napkin math for this stuff. Right. What I like about it is he's saying, look, as a scientist, we have some data available to us.
Yeah.
And looking at that data can lead you to some pretty alarming conclusions. So is this accurate? Who knows? But like, it's not like we have nothing to go on. If you know how fast they're going, you can infer a lot of things. If you know how bright they are, you can infer a lot of things.
Right. And it also says like, how many orders of magnitude out are we? It really says like, I've got a lot of room to be wrong here. And it is still scary.
He actually makes exactly that point at one point. He says, you know, the JAL pilot estimated the object was the size of an aircraft carrier. So, you know, a lot of the math is based on that. So he's like, well, how much room is there for him to be wrong? Well, at one point he says, when it was in front of him, it blocked the view out of the entire windscreen of the airplane. Well, you can only be so wrong. Like it is of a certain size.
Yeah. It has an arc distance this wide.
Exactly. Yeah. He also talked about transmedium craft, UFOs moving through water without experiencing any apparent resistance.
Wild.
We're running way over time, and I didn't understand this stuff. My brain was fried at this point. But if you are a physics type person, I really think you would like this talk. The
you
notes
can tell
in the show
us
notes.
What it all meant.
Yeah. Now, there's one last anecdote I want to share that I loved. My absolute favorite bit is he mentioned that there is, among UFO encounters, there is a commonly reported effect that they turn off electronics, right? You regularly hear about people in a car, the UFO flies overhead, the car dies. He shares the story of watching Close Encounters of the Third Kind as a kid. Now, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was made by Steven Spielberg. He was actually working with Jacques Vallée. One of the scientist characters in the movie is based on Jacques Vallée. And there is a lot in Close Encounters of the Third Kind that is pulled directly from real world encounters, real world witnesses. And one of the scenes in the movie has the guy driving his truck. The UFO flies overhead. His truck dies. And when it leaves, the truck starts up again. And as a kid, he watched that and he thought, well, that's ridiculous. Like, maybe it does something that kills the truck, but why would the truck start again?
Right.
What is the UFO sending a signal to restart? That's not like, as a kid, he immediately dismissed the whole movie.
Yeah.
But it must have eaten at him because he has a whole segment in here talking about how a UFO could stop a car engine. And he proceeds to explain how a car engine works.
Oh my God.
Disclaimer, I'm not an electrician, an auto mechanic, a science guy. I don't really understand what he said. I am briefly summarizing. Please go watch his talk. But he basically outlines the electrical circuit of the car and how, you send a charge through and it comes through and does things. And then there's a magnetic effect that kickstarts the next firing of the spark plug.
Sure.
When a strong electrical field passes over, it shorts out the circuit. So the engine dies.
Sure.
When that strong electrical field leaves, it puts a charge back into that circuit that causes the spark plug to fire. He says, if the piston is at the correct position, there may be fuel ready to ignite, and it may restart the engine. And you can look at this mathematically and say, about 10% of the time, the car would restart. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. If you go look at the experiencer lore and you look at all the reports of the people who report that their car died, about 10% of them report that it started up again afterward.
Curious. Yeah. I do love when scientists have that like nagging thing. Like,
right.
This has clearly been bugging them. Kid. Yeah, exactly. But 30 years later, they're gonna remember this, like on their deathbed. Like, I may not have done anything else, but at least I figured out that thing.
How that car started it. Now, hilariously, he pointed out that the model of truck in the movie was a diesel engine, and none of this would apply to diesel engines. It's like the car never should have stopped.
Yeah.
So Spielberg got a lot right. Apparently, he had the wrong model of truck.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right. We're an hour and 20 minutes in, but let's get to the final one. Let's get to the real meat of this. Karl Nell
real meat, huh?
I know. Talking about the Schumer Amendment and controlled disclosure. Now, there were a lot of people speaking. They all said great things. Karl Nell's presentation is the one that everyone was talking about the day of. It was the one that the slide leaked from, which caused a bit of a controversy. And even since then, after they put up the videos, it is not the most watched video, but it is the only one I have seen the community like actively discussing and tearing apart and talking about and really interested in. He was clearly onto something that is clicking with the community. Karl Nell, if you don't remember the name, is a retired Army colonel, former Army liaison to the UAP task force. We first heard his name in the article introducing David Grush as a whistleblower, where he backed up Grush's claims. The article said, Grush's assertion concerning the existence of a terrestrial arms race, occurring sub rosa over the past 80 years, focused on reverse engineering technologies of unknown origin, is fundamentally correct, as is the indisputable realization that at least some of these technologies of unknown origin derive from non-human intelligence, said Karl Nell, the retired Army colonel who worked with Grush on the UAP task force. And then they go on to say, in a 2022 performance evaluation, Laura A. Potter, Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, Headquarters, Department of the Army, described Nell as an officer with the strongest moral compass. We also talked about him because back when the Seoul conference happened, one of his slides outlining a plan for disclosure leaked, which caused a lot of discussion about the phrase catastrophic disclosure. As far as I can tell, he was the first one to kind of use that phrase, and everyone started talking about it at that point. Now,
briefly, I'm sorry, I know we're over time.
No.
His name is incredible. Are you familiar with the term nominative determinism?
No.
So the idea is that sometimes people's path, their fate, is determined by their name. Mm-hmm. Karl Nell is almost exactly like, if you slur it together, his name is Colonel.
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 That sounds like a name my D&D players would come up with.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oh my God. What a champion.
Yeah.
All right, carry on.
So his video is absolutely fascinating. Unfortunately, poor Karl Nell tried to fit an hour of talk into a 30-minute time slot.
Yeah, been there.
Yeah, and unfortunately for us, the first 20 minutes are a deep dive into the Schumer UAP disclosure bill, which failed to pass. When he gave the talk, it was still being debated and looked likely to pass. So his talk is very optimistic about what will happen when it passes. And, he's talking about how it's going to set up this advisory board that is in charge of the disclosure process. And here's what they need to think about. As a result, the part I found most interesting was the last 10 minutes of his talk, where he crams probably 30 minutes of slides about the disclosure process itself in after talking about Schumer. What we got was great, but oh my God, I wanted so much more detail. I would love to see him give a full dedicated talk just on this part of it, because he was the poor guy. He must have had the guy backstage like, wrap it up.
Exactly.
He's like getting so stressed as he goes. And he was just flying through these last few slides and glossing over points. So even though I got to hear him talk and look at his slides, some of them I'm still like, what the fuck did he mean by that?
Yeah.
So he starts hilariously by bringing up a list of reasons not to disclose. And he explains that any group planning for disclosure, such as the UAP review board that would have come about with Schumer, has to have a plan to address these concerns. And he says there are 6 big reasons. And he makes a point, like he's about to say some wild stuff, like maybe the military has an agreement with the aliens or something. He says he doesn't know if these are real concerns, but these are the kind of obvious concerns that you could derive from first principles. Why would someone be opposed to disclosure? Well, here are some possible reasons. So he broke it down into 6 categories. National security. We need to keep knowledge from our adversaries, or we need to protect people from themselves.
What does that mean?
Unfortunately, he did not explain, but a kind of common scenario I've heard is, imagine that the NHIs give us some sort of, thousands of megawatts power generation device that fits in a briefcase. Pretty easy to imagine how that could be turned into a bomb, intentionally or not. Maybe some of this stuff is just plain dangerous,
Right. Totally.
Point number 2, lack of a credible plan. Maybe the NHI intentions remain unknown. The people on the planet who know the most about it still have no idea. Or maybe the new physics or technology have unpredictable ramifications.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like we can't disclose because we don't want people to know that we don't know what's happening.
It's kind of a common thread in the community that like the real reason the Army doesn't want to disclose is because if your whole thing is we have a multi-trillion-dollar budget to protect US citizens and it comes out that there's a threat out there that you can do jack and shit about, well, why are we giving you so much money?
Right? Some big questions there.
Yeah. This next topic is probably the one that I think had the most like real world likely concerns. Societal disruption. First, he said, a challenge to legitimacy of existing authority structures.
How does that work?
Well, the example I've heard is if Tom DeLonge is right, and all of our gods throughout history have actually been aliens manipulating us, then the Catholic Church might collapse overnight.
Okay. But, okay, that's not like actual. Well, all right, sure. I guess that's a kind of authority. It's
a concern that Karl Nell is saying someone might oppose disclosure because they are worried about this. So if your group is pro-disclosure, you probably need to be working on a way to address these concerns, whether you think they're likely or not. Another one he brings up is ontological shock or a mimetic virus.
Ooh, those are like $5 words. I actually don't know either of those.
So ontological shock is a common phrase. I think it dates back to John Mack, but it refers to the shock you experience when you meet something truly alien, right? There's kind of a feeling of terror and shock. Your whole world has just been shook.
Yeah.
Mimetic virus? Like, I know that the word meme, we use it to mean joke, but it literally just means an idea. So I read this as an idea virus. I have no idea what he means. I would love to know more, Karl. Like, please give a longer version of this discussion.
Yeah. Quick Google says something like mimetics sees ideas as a kind of virus, something propagating in spite of truth and logic. Beliefs that survive aren't necessarily true, rules that survive aren't necessarily fair, and rituals that survive aren't necessarily necessary.
So this idea would be that something we learn from the NHI spreads like a virus and is destabilizing, you know?
Yeah. Or, even if it's not something we actually learn, but something we believe in spite of truth. An alternative fact, one might say.
The other concern he brings up is financial instability.
Well, that totally makes sense. Because I imagine the aliens here are offering luxury space communism, right?
Yeah, all the banks are going to collapse overnight. Yeah.
I mean, they do have a tendency to do that.
The next category is covert agreements. So you might have unaccountable parties advancing an unknown agenda. Maybe disclosure will precipitate or accelerate negative repercussions. Maybe there's a quid pro quo with the NHIs.
Like what? What's that?
A common kind of conspiracy theory is that the U.S. military made a deal with the Greys to allow them to abduct a certain number of Americans in exchange for advanced technology. So you can imagine how if that news leaked, that would go over pretty badly. Like, what do you mean? You agreed to allow aliens to experiment on us in exchange for Velcro.
Right. Yeah. Honestly, I feel like they don't even need to work that hard. Like, people are organ donors. Why wouldn't they be body donors for something cool like that?
That is a really good question. Next category is cover for misdeeds. You might have an unequitable accrual of power, privilege, or monetary gain.
No. Surely
or
not.
You might have significant criminal misconduct or violation of civil liberties.
Okay, yeah, these both sound 100% true.
Right? Yeah. Oops, we killed some dudes to keep the secret.
Yeah.
Sorry, you weren't supposed to ever find out about that. Yeah, Richard Doty might be facing some prison time there. Last category was organizational intransigence / distraction from priorities.
Wow. What was under that one?
Literally nothing. I think he ran out of space on the slide.
Okay. So I don't even know what intransigence is.
It's like resistance, reluctance. Yeah. I don't know, man.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if any of these are likely. Like I said, I think the societal impacts are the ones that I'm most like, yeah, I get it. We probably need to have a plan to at least kind of be prepared for the possibility of these. Some of these other ones, like if the US military has a secret arrangement with aliens, I don't know what we do about that. Like, yeah, of course they would oppose disclosure at that point. Like, this is going to look real bad for them if it comes out.
Yeah.
Now, on the other side of this same slide, he says, here are the reasons for disclosure. Right off the bat, you notice there are only 3 of them as opposed to 6 reasons not to disclose. But they had a lot more bullet points under them. First of all, he said, moral right. NHI existence is ultimately not government information, and it restores proper oversight and accountability to redress misdeeds.
Yeah. The only problem is the current gatekeepers, and most, are probably not actually swayed by morals.
Bingo. I'm not sure this argument is going to convince anyone. But yeah, he's right.
Yeah.
Next concern is disclosure averts catastrophic disclosure.
Right.
He says all of the disclosure concerns that we just talked about will be realized unless we manage risk through controlled disclosure. We transition our approach from reactive to proactive. We superintend the meaning and the message and the timing. And we mitigate negative effects of UAP knowledge, and we aggressively plan a transition to a post-disclosure world.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Got to plan it out.
And the final reason for disclosure is to prevent a loss of technological dominance. Again, Karl's background in the military is showing here. Dominance. But he says there is some evidence that suggests that the USA may be losing a UAP arms race. This is a terribly tantalizing detail that we've heard David Grush, among others, echo that there is some intelligence that suggests that Russia and China also have reverse engineering programs, and they may be having better luck than we are.
I can see it.
Right. What's the old astronaut joke, right? Like the US spent $1 million developing a pen that could write in space. The Russians used a pencil.
Yeah. Although we can get into why that didn't work out well for them.
I know. Yeah. It turns out graphite floating through the air, not great.
Not super great.
Compartmentalization hinders the scientific method, and a whole of government approach is required.
Right. Which is not a thing we do very well, but fucking China does.
Yeah. And that whole idea that compartmentalization is damaging the science. I mean, we've heard that claim over and over again. The EBO scientist, David Grush, others have said for years that, we do have these long running, the friggin' Wilson Davis memo said the same thing. We've had these long running programs and they can make no progress because they're all operating with both of their arms tied behind their back.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Karl Nell puts up this slide. He briefly goes over it in about 1 minute. I've dedicated more time to talking about it than he did. He said, if you look through these issues, you will realize that these are really not government issues. These issues are more effectively resolved in the private sector, in the academic sector, in legal reviews, political discussions, in the natural sciences. This tees up the opportunity for the Sol Foundation and the members here to contribute to the solution of this plan, because there needs to be a campaign plan to synchronize all of this.
Remember, kids, only you can prevent catastrophic disclosure.
That's right. Yeah. Now, I do really like this idea that, again, we're seeing this through line through the whole conference that, we need to get the government involved and push them forward. But also, like academics need to get involved, lawyers need to get involved. We need other people to destigmatize and approach this, because there are a lot of concerns. How do you deal with avoiding the banks collapsing when luxury space communism gets here? Well, I don't know, but maybe we should think about it before it happens.
But we should talk. Yeah.
So he says there are 3 important parts to the proposed end state of a disclosure plan. First of all, oversight. We need to restore proper federal government oversight over all UAP legacy and ongoing program efforts. 2, actual disclosure. We need to prevent UAP catastrophic disclosure through successful implementation of policy recommendations. He said, quote, "We want disclosure, but we want to get it through a controlled process that doesn't cause societal collapse."
Yeah, I mean, it's a goal.
Yeah. And third, science. Transformative technological and societal advancement derived from successful UAP science and technology and NHI engagement.
Yeah, it's a pretty good summary.
Right. Like if you're trying to come up with a plan for how you address disclosure, I think these are 3 really good end goals. Hey, we've got a problem right now where a rogue group has been lying to Congress. We got to fix that shit. We got to make sure that disclosure doesn't cause more problems than it solves. And it'd be really nice if we got some science out of this. Like right now, we're not really able to do any, right? Those are good goals.
Totally.
So all of that brings us back to the slide that leaked. He said, here's the obligatory DOD type of campaign plan chart, which made everybody in the room laugh. This slide was absurdly complex. We talked about this slide back then, but now we have the context for the slide. He's not sharing an existing plan that he's privy to. He's proposing this as a framework for how a disclosure plan could work and what would need to happen. What are the milestones, right? He's outlining a plan that would restore oversight, avoid catastrophic disclosure, and advance scientific understanding. At this point, he points at the slide. He said, disclosure is a process. It's not an event. And it's going to stair-step across these phases. Now, off to the left, he's got a gray box called Phase 0, called Shaping, and it involved things that have already happened, like ATIP, the leaked Navy videos, 2017 New York Times article, like basically like getting information out into the public so people would stop rejecting the very idea of it. Phase 1, called Demonstrate Existence, had a goal of government acceptance. Now, he pulls this one up and he says, okay, we've had Phase 1. We have completed Phase 1. I would argue Phase 1 ends when we get to Schumer's Disclosure Act. And so it says demonstrate UAP existence by January of 2024. And you're like, well, that's crazy. It's never going to happen. It probably won't happen in my lifetime. I'm saying it's already happened. The Gang of 8 just said that we need this legislation because they don't have proper oversight.
Yeah. I wonder how he feels now after that didn't pass.
Yeah. All the more reason that I would love to see him give this talk again. Phase 2 is called Correlate Signatures. It was targeted for January 2026, and it has a goal of academic acceptance.
Yeah. I said that when I said this when we first talked about it, but this still feels just wildly optimistic.
I totally get that. But it is interesting that you say that because Garry Nolan was interviewed recently, and the person interviewing him asked if, now that he's done the Soul Foundation, which was emphasizing getting scientists on board, is he seeing a change in how seriously academics and scientists take the phenomenon?
Oh, cool.
And Garry Nolan says, the short answer is yes, and incredibly so. Just looking at the audience at the Soul Symposium itself, it was probably about a third academics from various disciplines. I counted and saw at least a dozen Stanford professors in the audience, many of whom I only know of them as Stanford professors. I don't know them personally. Many of whom afterwards wrote to me and said, thank you for this. I've always been interested in the area, but I never felt comfortable going to the kinds of meetings that were advertised. So having a sober discussion and a place where non-hyperbolic discussion could be had was welcome to them. I gave
Nice.
a talk at Harvard Medical School, and the organizer said, now, how much of your time are you going to use to talk about UAP? Would you please at least address the topic in your talk, because everyone wants to hear about it? And,
Okay.
he said, I mean, the room was packed. And I said, I'd be happy to come back another time to talk about UAP, but I haven't prepared for it today.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the third time in recent months that I've been asked to take time out of my day talk to talk about UAP, because people are so excited. There's not a dinner I go to. I mean, that evening at Harvard, at the dinner, all anyone wanted to talk about was UAP. They didn't want to talk about the stuff about cancer.
Oh, that's brutal for him. Like, dedicates his life to one thing
and stride.
Yeah. It's like, all we want to know is how your side hustle's going.
Right. But I do think it's really interesting. If there's anybody who is well positioned to see this, it's Garry Nolan. And he has talked before about the idea that, when he first started getting into the topic, people would tell him, like, this is going to be career suicide. No one will touch you. He's like, it hasn't been. It's been fine.
Yeah. Good for him.
Now I'm going to briefly keep going with the slide. Phase 3 is called Characterized Performance. It's targeted for October 2030, and it has a goal of public acceptance. He said, this would be the final phase driven by the government, because it's going to end with public disclosure. So from that point forward, the ongoing work is going to be done in the humanities, in scientific investigations, and the private sector.
Oh, okay. So this makes more sense. That's what's going on with all the all the arrows are converging there. So that makes more sense now.
So the slide will be linked in the show notes, but for anybody who's not looking at it, there's 4 arrows moving across the slide labeled lines of effort, and the line of effort A for government ends at phase 3. And when we were talking about the first time, we were like, I don't know why. I guess the government doesn't do anything.
It's done.
Well, now we get it. He's saying that the government is involved until there's public disclosure. They may still do things afterwards, but their work is more preparatory. Their ongoing work is going to be what we do in the real world. Hey, how do we handle this now that everyone knows?
Yeah. Their disclosure work is done.
Right. Now, he also says we should not wait for the government, since most of the reasons not to disclose were not necessarily government-driven problems. He said we should work to address the ones that we can to make it less risky to advance disclosure. Now, at this point, he is flying through these slides. So he puts up 4 slides of rapid fire that all kind of have bullet points of things that need doing in the various lines of effort. So the first one is line of effort A, the government. First bullet point, enact the Schumer Amendment. Womp womp. 2, grant legal amnesty for past misdeeds. Now, we've talked about this before. This is something that I think needs to happen, or you're never going to get anywhere. Like, unless we have a truth and reconciliation type thing, the best evidence we have is people have committed crimes. And if those people are on the hook for going to prison as a result of that, they are never going to cooperate. So I think you got to have amnesty.
Couldn't we send them through a morality arc like your D&D campaign?
I'm on board. I understand why people are advocating for amnesty. He says we need to centralize all UAP data. Ironically, this is one of the only bits of the Schumer Amendment that survived. We have started a new department in the archives that is for gathering it. There are problems with it. We've talked about it before. We'll talk about it again. They're still working on it, but centralizing UAP data. And then lastly, he says we need to fund a national level UAP research project akin to the Manhattan Project.
I mean, these are all good goals. I don't know. That last one seems like seems like we kind of already have too much national level secret stuff going on. Maybe that's not the answer.
He would say that this one should not be secret, that this would happen after we get to the point where it's okay for the government to have a public program. But, that's in a world where the Schumer Amendment passed and the government reclaimed all the UFOs that they've given to Lockheed Martin and stuff, I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Line of effort B is labeled as the humanities, which is a hilariously broad category, but all right.
Right. Yeah.
He says we need to develop sociological models for analyzing societal impact of UAP disclosure and mitigation of possible ontological shock. Okay, sure. We need to codify laws of ethics in an environment where we might have a hierarchy of being, where everyone isn't necessarily having equal competitive potential.
What does that mean?
So, thankfully, this is the one bullet point he explained a little bit when he pulled it up. He said, so you got the problem of a more advanced civilization coming in and disrupting a less advanced civilization. It's the same issue, whether we're talking about AI or colonialism or NHI. Okay, fair.
All right,
Humanities needs to deal with, how do we make sure that our culture isn't obliterated when we meet NHI?
Right.
Line of effort C, the natural sciences. We need to extend the theoretical as well as practical methods of material science, enabling accurate prediction and modeling of unique properties associated with novel molecular configurations and isotopic ratios across classes of metamaterials.
Wow. That sounds like a really complicated way of saying, figure out how the aliens made this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Line of effort D is the private sector, and I'm just going to rephrase these final ones because this slide was the worst, most verbal diarrhea. But yeah, he said, we need to look into how corporations can legally collaborate to reverse engineer NHI tech that is currently on loan from the government. Fair. Currently they're all working independently. We need to figure out the legal issues of ownership of NHI tech.
Right.
Yeah, this should have happened before Schumer got passed because we are finding out more and more that it was the eminent domain clause that spiked Schumer. We're hearing that really reliably across the board. Nobody was really opposed to any of the other shit, but the idea that the government was just going to go take stuff was a hot button issue with a lot of people.
So crazy.
And lastly, he phrased this a lot more politely, but basically, we need to figure out how to introduce new energy sources without destroying every existing energy company.
Oh no, won't someone think of the oil companies? Yeah, whatever.
I feel the same way, but I understand why it would be a bullet point. Like, hey, maybe we don't do the thing that immediately capsizes, some of the biggest companies in the world.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, that was a lot. But Sol Foundation, good stuff. If you liked any of this, the videos are in the show notes. They're all very watchable. And if I made them sound boring or dry, I really apologize. I think they're very good, as long as you're not sitting down and watching 6 of them back to back and taking notes to produce a podcast.
Maybe we should have done 2 different podcasts on this one.
Maybe. I kind of wanted to be done with it. You're starting to get a glimpse into how I was in school, Chuck. I was not the greatest student.
I understand. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on It's a Very Exciting Time. You can find show notes and more on our website, veryexcitingtime.com, as well as links to our social media accounts.
And you can email us at Scott or Chuck at veryexcitingtime.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at patreon.com/veryexcitingtime.
Yep, where we just uploaded a second Q&A video. Yeah.
Well, we haven't uploaded it yet, but we will.
By the time they're hearing this. Okay. And Chuck,
good point.
As always, my wife thanks you for listening to me talk about UFOs, so she doesn't have to.
Still kind of has to.
She does.